Okay. Let me make sure I can see my sound monitor here. Okay. So this is HESI Reading Mock 3, and I'm in the process right now of not only sort of recreating certain mocks content-wise, but also trying to, I guess I've been trying to get the mock classes a little shorter, but more informative and more powerful, which is obviously something easier said than done. One of the things I'm going to try really hard to do a really good job of emphasizing in this mock is the way that you're doing your outlining of your passages and the importance of outlining your passages. I'm not going to go on a 2-hour rant, as I very well could and have in many of my classes, about the importance of the critical strategy. But I am going to provide you with what I said each paragraph is focused on, and I'm going to do that in every passage. I'm going to do that really fast because the reason I don't go through every outline typically is how long it makes the video, and I don't want to make these longer. So I'm going to very quickly just tell you what I thought each passage was focused on and what I thought each paragraph was focused on. My disclosure with that is keep in mind that you and I could have quite different information in our outline, and we could both be right. So I'm going to really emphasize the fact that outlining can be done very, very broadly. It can be done very specifically, and there's a million different points in between the broadest and the most specific outline. And there's not a right answer to that, because if you do a really broad outline and that makes you feel good about your time, and then you can kind of go back and be more serious about it when and if you get a question about it, that's fine. I have done my own critical strategy for so long that I think a lot of my outlines are more specific than probably a lot of the ones that you do. So just kind of keep that in mind, that I'm extremely, extremely practiced at the strategy. So I'm able to move at a very, very, very fast pace, but be very specific with my outlines. You do not have to be that specific to be successful with that. The importance of outlining is really just having thought very briefly about whether a paragraph was put there for a specific reason, what that specific reason was, why that's the most effective way to put the paragraph there, and so on. So you just want to be going into your questions having identified the main idea and really having identified the purpose of each of the paragraphs, the focus of each paragraph, because that really helps. And I'm going to point out lots and lots of instances in this class where having done that is why you are so good at answering certain questions. So I'm really going to put an emphasis on, because I did my critical strategy and I did a good job of it when I first read the passage, that's why I know this answer right off the top of my head. Because the thing that I get asked about a lot is, well, doesn't the critical reading strategy take me more time? Doesn't that slow me down? And I hear of a lot of people still, even as much emphasis as I have put on the critical reading strategy, breaking down the paragraphs, thinking about what they're there for, and how much that helps and how much it can save you time. Despite a heavy emphasis on that, depending on which exact classes you've taken, I still often get people who go and they take their real test and they don't use it because they're afraid it's going to take them too much time. And then that compromises your accuracy. So I guess my stance on the critical reading strategy is, yes, practice makes perfect, and practice of the strategy is what allows you to do it fast enough to be effective. So you should have been practicing it on everything. You should have been practicing your critical strategy on every passage you've read, because you learned it in reading 1, and then you did 4 other or 3 other reading classes. And in all of those, you had chances to use the strategy on every single thing you did, every passage that you identified purpose in. So all throughout reading 2, and every passage that you did for logical conclusion and inference, all through reading 3, all of those were chances to use that. And you can still go back if you didn't and use them. This is mock 3, most likely. I will end up making this, even though it is version 3, the first mock that people see in the future of the program, because I want to make sure that this is emphasized properly. So I'm going to give you every paragraph breakdown that I did. I've got it on paper. I just took this test the exact same way that you just took this test. So I'm going to be reading off my paper copy to give you those outlines and everything so that we can see more of how we're lining up. And maybe you'll be able to discover that the questions you're missing are due to possibly a fault in your critical strategy, and possibly not. You might discover that you're doing great with critical strategy. You're still going to miss questions. You're always going to miss questions. But you should be missing very few if you are very good at the strategy. Everybody always kind of struggles with reading. It's kind of the hardest part of all of this. Everybody always doubts the strategy and doubts the other. Essentially, everybody doubts themselves in all facets of reading. And I always get the question of, if there's just one thing that I could tell you about reading that would make it easier, what would it be? And I always say the same thing. I always say, get really good at the critical strategy. Get to where you believe in it 100%, to where you'd never read something without the strategy again. Get to where you're really fast at it so that you never have that thought of, could it compromise my time? And use that to be good at everything else. So some of these passages have content crossover with the actual versions that are available of the HESI. I won't necessarily point out which ones do, and I will tell you, I write the passages differently. So when I say that there is content crossover, what I basically mean is you could get a passage on your HESI that talks about the same thing that I'm talking about in my passage. That said, you should expect it to say different things, maybe be organized in a different way, maybe not. I try to keep the focuses in the same type of lineup, but when you see something that is familiar on the HESI, you will gain some time because you've read about it before, but make sure you still use your critical strategy, because due to copyrights and ethical practices in tutoring, I can give you subject matter that you're going to see, and that's perfectly okay, but I can't copy it, and I wouldn't copy it because I don't want to throw you off. So some of this subject matter, I guess my point is, each of these passages, if you've broken them down before you ever see the test, you will be in a better position at the test if you do end up getting the same content, but you still need to enact your critical strategy. You still need to deeply think about each paragraph, because I may not focus the same way that they do. So the first passage, when I read the intro paragraph, I said what the main idea is, and I'm not going to write these down for time's sake and for copyright's sake, as far as my copyrights as a curriculum writer. I'm just going to say them. So if you don't hear something, or a lot of my focuses are super long, it's like a lot of information, just back the video up 15 seconds and hear me say it again. You can certainly write down what I say. All I ask is the same thing I always ask, that you don't put the things that I've designed and I've worked on and my strategies that I've come up with. All the things that I teach you are things that are original to me, and they are why I'm successful in this field, and I would like to continue to be. So my ask is that you don't essentially violate my copyrights and put my content in front of anybody else. So you're welcome to write down what my focuses are. I just try not to put so much information in writing. So I'm going to read them, and that's going to save a lot of time because it's hard for me to write it all on here anyway. But you can very easily miss something. You could very easily want to hear an entire outline again. And if you do, just back the video up. I would guess the little 15-second button is probably typically enough, but if it's not, hit it a couple times, go back to the beginning, hear my outline again. You're more than welcome to pause, write what I said, back it up again, pause, that's fine. But I will tell you the main idea from the intro, because that's where you're always supposed to find a main idea. And then I'll tell you what I felt each paragraph's purpose was beyond that. The first paragraph of this one told us that our main idea is a study that shows that short naps might be highly effective for two things: feeling better and learning and remembering. You may not have put that much detail in your main idea. You might have said, short naps are effective. You might have said that there was a study about short naps and that it showed they were effective. Here's what you have to have in your main idea. You must have caught that it is about a study. There's a difference between a passage that's just explaining something to you that mentions a study as part of that explanation, and we're going to see that in this mock test also. But then if they mention it in the intro, they are not writing an article about the fact that cat naps might be good. They are writing an article about a study that showed this. So the focus of all your paragraphs is going to be very different if the point of the passage is a study than it's going to be if a study is just a quick accessory to help them explain something. The difference, and I get that question a lot, what is the difference? How do I know if I should put the study in the main idea or not? You'll never screw that up if you're using critical strategy, because if it's in the first paragraph, if it's mentioned, if study is a word that you see as they are playing out their main idea for the first time, then it is part of the main idea. Otherwise, so if it's a case where they do mention a study, but you shouldn't put that in your main idea, they're not going to mention the study till later. So if it's in the intro and they actually say a recent study shows, and then they make their point, study is part of their point. If study is not in the intro, but you see it later, generally speaking, 99% of the time, that's just one of your focuses. It's not a main idea. It's not the point of the whole thing. So the study is critical, and then that short naps or cat naps, if you name it the same way that they did, are shown in this particular study to be highly effective. You don't have to have the what they're effective at written in your main idea necessarily, just that it is the whole thing, this whole article is going to be about a study that shows the effectiveness of cat naps or short naps as being effective. So that is what you had to have there. What I said the second paragraph was about was how they did the study. And remember that how is always a paragraph if your main idea is a study. You can't write an essay about a study and not tell how you did it. So that's another indicator that this is part of your main idea, is that there is a paragraph that is about how it was done. So it was how, and then a little bit of the general results. So it kind of says, here's how the study was done, tying it back to this. And then it says people who took a nap were more effective at what the study was about than people who didn't take a nap. So it was the very general results. The next paragraph gets a lot more specific. What I said for the third paragraph is the study shows particular associations between sleep and brain function. They get very specific there. You could never possibly have an outline that shows everything they talk about. You just need to know that this paragraph goes into detail about specific chemistries, specific instances, specific things that happen in the brain, and that backs up the general results they had there and the general effectiveness that they talked about in the first paragraph. So what I had there was study shows particular associations between sleep and brain function was what I wrote for that one. The fourth paragraph says specifics about storage of information and remembering. So the fourth paragraph goes into specifics about the fact that sleeping plays a role in sorting through information, deciding what to keep, forming memories, and essentially what the connection is between sleep and the process of remembering and processing info. The last paragraph is a broadening paragraph. So they've been very specific this whole time about cat naps and sleep and brain chemistry and all these little details. And they were talking about naps because remember your main idea was short naps or cat naps. The last paragraph, they broaden it back out and they say, don't forget, a cat nap doesn't replace regular sleep. So they're kind of letting you know that the key to just generally learning and remembering info and doing well in something like what you're doing right now is getting regular sleep every night and how much that is and what that is. And that cat naps are an enhancement to that. They don't replace regular sleep. So if you were just not sleeping at night and taking cat naps right and left, that wouldn't be effective. So they're being more specific about how their study and the aspects that they studied fit into a normal regimen and the importance of that with the results that they're talking about. So you can't get the results that they're talking about for cat naps unless you're also getting regular sleep. I will tell you what class every question is from. I've mentioned a lot in my more recent mocks. There's a lot of questions that actually aren't really exactly from a certain class, in the sense that I didn't say this is a certain category and we're going to talk about that certain category. The way that the lectures are organized is these are main idea questions. These are theme questions. These are summary questions. These are logical conclusion or inference. There's a lot of questions that don't quite fit a template like that. Those, I will always say, are from reading 1, because if you use critical strategy, you identify the main idea up front and you're reading a passage thinking about why are these paragraphs here? Why did the author choose this? What was the author's purpose, as well as what was their main idea or their main focus? Having that information in the best possible form, which comes from applying the critical reading strategy and applying it well, will answer a ton of questions. There's a ton of questions that you don't need to specifically study the answering of a certain question, because understanding the main idea of the passage, how they built up their main idea, how they supported themselves and what they were saying, how they organized their info, what their purpose was, who their audience was, all the things you think about when you do critical strategy, answer a tremendous number of questions that, because you decided you were going to use this strategy and get really good at it, you don't have to study these question types. So I will point out when it's not exactly a group that you studied, it's something you're going to know the answer to because you used critical strategy. I guess as a quick mention, if you didn't use critical strategy when you did this test, if you asked me what my honest, big, true suggestion is, I would suggest not playing this mock video right now. If you know that you didn't use critical strategy or you didn't use it well, you weren't focused on it, you didn't use it every time, I would reprint the test. I would retake the test. I would use the heck out of critical strategy while you're on your way through it. And then I would play the mock. So in other words, don't ever waste an opportunity to get good at critical strategy. If you didn't use this test and the things in it to continue practicing and refining critical strategy, I wouldn't listen to the answers right now. I would go back and take it again. If you do that, you can compare the answers you got on the test that's sitting in front of you now where you didn't use it to the answers you got when you did. And I guarantee if you do go to play the video later and you grade both of your tests, you will do better on the one that you used critical strategy by a lot. So as a side note, if you know you didn't use it, you didn't do a good job of it, you didn't write down the info I just gave paragraph by paragraph, don't look at the answers right now. Don't do the video right now. Do your test, use critical strategy. That way you can see if you're matching up with me and you can get as many answers as possible correct. Question 1 is from reading 1. What is the main idea? You're almost always going to get that question. In this case, the answer was pretty obvious. It was B, because it says brief naps, which we know was a critical part of our main idea, lead to better comprehension and understanding of information. So ultimately, that's what the author focused on, was brief naps and what they do with memory or learning. In that case, anytime that answers are close together, I will explain the other ones. Anytime that they're not, that's a place we can save time. So I'm not going to explain A, C, and D, but if you had that one wrong, send me a picture, ask me about why my answer is better than yours. According to the article, sleeping helps with everything except. I'm going to tag this as reading 1 because, and here's the note that I wrote myself when I just did the test, details are easy to keep together, with the context you got from your breakdown strategy. Using the breakdown strategy means you understood the passage better and you remember it better. Remembering the passage is what allows you to be like, oh, you know what? They never mentioned appetite, but they did mention being tired, memory, and learning. So most of these just general questions where they ask what the author did or didn't talk about or what kind of details were there or not there come from you having used your strategy. So that one would be D. Question 3, what happens when acetylcholine levels decrease in the brain? I'm also going to tag this as reading 1. This is a very passage specific question, so it doesn't fit a category. You having really broken everything down and you knowing what was in paragraph 3 specifically would allow you to very easily say, oh, a person's memory improves. So they talked about acetylcholine, what happens when the levels go up or down, and they said memory is associated with lower levels or decreased levels. Number 4 says, what is one of the primary purposes of sleep according to this passage? I would call this reading 1. It does say the word purpose, but it's asking for the purpose of sleep as opposed to the purpose of the passage. So one of the primary purposes of sleep would be to allow a person mentally to sort out important and unnecessary info. This aligns with your main idea, and that's an important part of this because when they say, why do you sleep? That is a question very related to what the main idea happened to be in this case. 5 says, which of the following statements best states the conclusion of the passage? Again, twice in a row with these questions, they kind of tricked you here. It's not asking conclusion like you normally see it in class, which would be a logical conclusion. This is not a logical conclusion question. It's not an inference question. What it's asking is to state the conclusion of the passage. And that's another way of essentially asking you for the summary and or a combination of the summary and the main point. So I guess you could say this is mostly reading 1 because really you're going to answer this because you used the critical strategy and you know what point the author ultimately was trying to make. But actually, I'm going to say you could get this out of reading 1, 2, and 3 combined because it has to do with being able to sort of form a summary, being able to think about the main point, and being able to think about the main point in context of what the author's purpose was. What was the author really trying to convey? Again, if you used critical strategy, this was easy. The main point was D. So we got study in there, which is very important. We got catnaps, and we have that they're more effective than you might think. That essentially reiterates that first main idea sentence. The next passage here is what my breakdowns and main idea were. Again, you can always pause and back me up a few seconds to rehear something. When I read the intro paragraph, because remember, you should always have your main idea formed before you read past the first paragraph, the intro paragraph. I said the CDC reports sleep loss is a common and critical issue. I also wrote one of the biggest. So I felt like from reading their intro, I got a little bit of an understanding of who the CDC is, but that's not the main idea. And essentially they said sleep loss is really bad. It really affects a lot of things and it's really common. That was what I gathered out of there. Again, you can word your main idea however you want, as long as you have the critical components in there. The CDC reporting it is somewhat critical, but you can be okay if you didn't say CDC in your main idea. Sleep loss being common and dangerous are the two things. So sleep loss being common and being dangerous. If you didn't have those two things in one form or another, you don't have to use the words that I'm using. But if you didn't see that it is common, it's affecting a lot of people, it's a major health issue, and that it causes major effects as opposed to really minor effects in the long term. That's what you should have gotten. The second paragraph, I said previously known effects of sleep loss and issues it contributes to. So they're not saying that they just found out that all these effects could happen. They've known this. These are known effects of sleep loss. They have recently studied more into them, but they've also recently studied into how common is this? So this was essentially them giving you context about some things we already knew that adequate sleep has a role in. The third paragraph, I said, so the third paragraph focuses on a study. So this is an example, and I promised I would point this out, of where a study was just used as one of our focuses along the way. It's not part of the main idea. They did not say study up here unless I missed something. This is just one thing that they're using amongst other things that they're using to explain the sleep loss issue. This study showed, this study initiated the announcement. So them doing this study brought about partially, it was not the only thing that brought about this announcement about sleep loss, but it had to do with it. So they're mentioning the study because this study showed the frequency of sleep loss. So this paragraph was a study, the fact that it's showing the frequency of sleep loss in two different ways, and the fact that they did the study in a particular way. So you almost have like a mini passage here. They described the study in full. They introduced the study. They said, here's what the study found results-wise. Here's how the study found those results. You almost have a little teeny tiny passage within a passage. The focus of this, we're always thinking about why is each paragraph there in reference to the main idea and what that was. The study is helping to explain the main idea in the sense of how prevalent sleep loss is. The fourth paragraph, I said how much it's not happening, how common, I guess, the commonality of sleep loss. And then it briefly explains the reason that now we're having this problem, which is technology-related distractions. So I said how common it is, and I said the why behind it was tech-related distraction. The last paragraph essentially brings up a whole new random thing that relates to all of this, which is the immediate danger of like actual critical sleep loss things that could happen. It focuses mainly on car accidents. But what I said for the last paragraph was big and critical danger of sleep loss, car accidents, and they did a conclusion as well. So they brought up that not only does it have these long-term chronic effects, it also has immediate dangers like car accidents. And then it says, it would seem that spending less time sleeping can do these three really big things. And that sort of sums up each of the passage or each of the paragraphs, each of the focuses that we had along the way. 6 is obviously a reading 1 question. It's main idea. The best main idea is D. I did write explanations for the other 3, which means I might have felt like you could have gotten this wrong potentially. A, what I said about why A is not right. A is true, but our focus is more specific. So it's not about the CDC keeping an eye out for threats to health. That was mentioned, but it is about a specific threat. B, I also said was true, but it's a very specific detail as opposed to the main focus. And I said the same thing about C, true, but detail. So all of those were little details or too broad of a detail. So this one's too broad. These 2 are too specific. D is perfect. Lack of adequate sleep, so it's not specifying a certain amount, is becoming a major health problem, which was the original point that they made before they got more specific about it. 7, I also tagged as being from reading 1. According to the passage, the CDC wanted to know how many, and then the answer would be C, how many Americans are not getting adequate amounts of sleep. The how many was really the focus. How common is this issue? So the study was about, what I wrote here was percents of people losing sleep. So that was the key focus. They did talk about the effects as well, but that what they sought information-wise was how common is this? They did a study to find out how common the issue is. Number 8 is a word in context. Words in context have to do with a little bit of luck. and a lot of reading the passage well in the first place. So what does the word surfing mean as used in the passage? The way they used it was looking at different websites on the internet. You could define surfing a lot of ways for the way that they used it here, but the other answers are terrible, so that should have taken you there. Reading one is very important to this because having a deep understanding of all the things we keep mentioning that come from the critical reading strategy make it very easy to pick up how they're using a word the same way that you pick up why they used a certain detail, why they implemented a certain paragraph, and so on. So understanding the method to the author's madness has everything to do with critical reading. 9, same thing. So it requires you to know what the different focuses were throughout the passage. All of the following are potential risks from inadequate sleep except cancer. We saw a question like this on the last passage too. If you read the passage with the critical strategy and you really paid attention, you know they didn't mention cancer. It was the other things that they mentioned. According to the passage, how many hours of sleep does the average adult need per night? So that is a detail that is in the 4th paragraph. And again, I'm tagging it as reading 1 because knowing that the 4th paragraph was about this, you'll know right where to go. So even if you don't remember that it said 7 to 9, and you might, because it's much easier to remember little things like that when you're using the strategy than when you're not. Otherwise, though, you'll go, how many hours of sleep? And then you'll realize, oh, that was mentioned in the 4th paragraph because I've got it in my outline. 11 says, what is a detail from the passage that supports the fact that? And then they give you something specific. Always be careful with this because they're giving you a specific thing to support. They're not saying that this thing is totally true and totally not true. They're just saying that this is something that they want you to pick a detail that would support if the detail were to be alongside this piece of info. This is from reading 1, primarily your understanding of the passage and how the details come together. It also would relate to reading 6 a little bit because reading 6 goes into a bit better explanations of how do we pick a best detail. So if you're still having trouble with best detail, reading 6 is one of the T's classes, but it can give you some context on text structuring, which is important, and on how you use details to support something. What's important about a best detail is that the detail very clearly and specifically supports the thing we're trying to support. And essentially the way I talk about it in reading 6 is I say, if I said the detail that, if I said the thing to you that it's wanting you to support, which in this case is inadequate rest could pose an immediate threat to safety. If you told me after I said that to you that I'm crazy, inadequate rest does not pose an immediate threat to safety, what would I want to come back with? What would I want to say back to you that would help me justify the fact that it does, in fact, pose an immediate risk? The key to this one is an immediate threat and that it's a threat to safety as opposed to your general health. So what stands out to me here is it's got to be immediate because this article discussed long-term, but it also discussed car accidents, which would be instantaneous, and that it's a threat to safety as opposed to general health because, again, they mentioned each of those things and they mentioned them quite separately. The one that's going to work for this is B. Along with, and this is just a sentence that's straight out of the article, along with the above mentioned health risks that chronic sleep loss can bring, many also believe that a high percentage of car accidents are caused by or influenced by fatigue. That would say there is an immediate threat to safety. That is the way that was approached in the article. What I wrote next to the other answers for A, I said, how much sleep is needed is the focus of A. That does not involve the risks at all. So yes, it's important certainly to know how much sleep is appropriate, but that doesn't help us prove that there's an immediate threat to safety. C, I said it's general. It mentions it, but it's not focused on it at all. It just says you're driving riskier. That would be the second best thing of what we have here to explain the point, but it's better if you actually say a high percentage of car accidents are caused by. That's better than just saying your driving is riskier. This is meant to follow, and this is something I always talk about when I talk about best details, that was meant to follow the detail given in B. So you don't want the detail that follows the bigger, more important detail. You want the bigger, more important one. D, I wrote long-term. So this was the key difference in zoning into immediate and safety. This is talking about your long-term health effects as opposed to your immediate safety. This next passage I wrote right at the top of my test. I said, no main idea. No main idea in the intro. I mean, you could read the whole thing certainly and summarize it, which would arguably provide a possible main idea, but this is not a passage. This is a note written from one person to the other. So really you just needed a focus for each thing. What I mean is they didn't introduce a point and then proceed to explain the point. They skipped introducing the point and just went straight into details. So they could have done a paragraph at the beginning that said, thank you for coming. I'm so glad we get to go out and do this thing today because you're babysitting the kid. But they didn't. So they went straight into food, taking her out and what would be involved if you took this kid out of the house, and then napping. So those were each focuses, and you're essentially lacking an intro. If you were confused about that or wondering about that a little bit, hopefully that helps you clarify that your thought processes were correct. You did not need to find a main idea. Number 12 is from reading 2 because it has to do with purpose. Remember that purpose involves audience. So when you go to think, like you should with every passage as soon as you're done reading it, when you go to think about the purpose, you're kind of also thinking about who was this written to. This was written probably to a babysitter. We wouldn't say a nurse because it doesn't have anything that's really about health or taking care of a certain thing. And then it's saying to whom as opposed to for whom. So a mother or a father would more so be probably who wrote it. Having an idea of the main concept of the whole thing and the purpose of the whole thing would allow you to answer that. And also the next one. The next one is an actual audience question. Well, they both are because one of them's the audience to whom it's being written. The other is who the writer is. A and B are meant to trick you because you can't discern between them. You can't say it was for sure a mom or for sure a dad because there's nothing that identifies the gender or the position of the parent. So you get down to the end. This is where reading all choices is critical. I remember 2 to 3 times while I was taking this mock that I wrote that down. Read all your choices, especially if you're like a mom, a dad. Wait a second. Do I know whether it was a mom or a dad? Keep reading your choices because they probably end up giving you something much better. In this case, parent is perfect because then you don't have to discern gender. Not to a teacher because it sounds very specific to the kid being at home. 14, I said, comes from 1. It's very much a part of the critical strategy if they ask you for a specific focus from a specific paragraph. I already thought about this. I already wrote down that the 3rd paragraph was about the nap. And that allows me to very quickly pick an answer on this one. I don't know why I didn't pick an answer on this one. So let's look at these because I don't have an answer circled. Explaining what to do throughout the day. So the 3rd paragraph was very much focused on the nap and how to do the nap and the fact she may or may not nap and what they call it. When she doesn't nap, they call it rest time instead of calling it nap. I can recite all that even though I read this like an hour ago. And that's because of having my focuses. So if I think, oh, that was about nap, that allows me to remember a lot. That's just me talking about critical strategy again, as opposed to the question. Explaining it's fine to take her out was paragraph 2. This was really kind of the whole thing, whole passage. So A was the whole passage. B was paragraph 2. The best procedure to get her to nap is a great answer. Explaining why she needs a nap. So C and D are obviously both about the nap. They really didn't explain why she needs a nap, so that wouldn't be a good answer. And remember, this said it's focused on, which is another way of asking, why is it there? Why is the 3rd paragraph there? The third paragraph is definitely for the procedure of getting her to nap. Much more of the words that we see in the paragraph have to do with how to do it, music. I don't remember if they mentioned changing a diaper, but changing a diaper, music, something about mosquito bites and putting cream on. So it was all about how to get her to maybe sleep if she's going to. 15 also references the third paragraph, but it references inferring something. So that comes from reading 3. I wrote down, what I wrote down next to 3 is I said 1 is also important because the critical strategy points out the location. So for the same reason that it was easy for me to think back and recite what they said in paragraph 3 when I did this, and the reason that it was easy for me to answer the question right above this one, all has to do with critical strategy because I categorized the info, allowing me to remember it better. This one I wrote B is the proper inference. Anytime it's inference, I'll give you the details. A gives a number and we don't know the number. So A would fall into the too far category. We don't know if it's 50% of the time. We just know that there are many circumstances where she does and doesn't nap. Getting a number involved is something that's too far for the knowledge that we have. The reason that B works is she says, you know, they're focusing on getting her to go to sleep, getting her to nap. And it says if you're talking about meds in a paragraph about a nap, I realize that's not the greatest explanation. So they're talking about how to get her to nap. And then they mention medication for mosquito bites. If you take that and the very general common knowledge that you have about mosquito bites, but even if you didn't have general knowledge about them, they could create a disturbance to her sleep because we're saying, oh, put this cream on before she goes to sleep. And that allows us to infer that if you don't put that cream on, she might have less of a chance to sleep. That's why it's in that paragraph and in the procedure. So that allows us to assume that they may create disturbance. Obviously, most of us know mosquito bites itch, so that would also help. For C, I wrote down stated. So rest time is what happens when she doesn't fall asleep. They said that. They said they call it that. The music is the most important part of the nap ritual. We don't know that it's most important. They didn't overemphasize one thing or another. So I said that D was too far. The next passage. So the main idea that I got from the intro paragraph was spanking. Some say good, some say bad. So what you should have come out of here knowing about the main idea is that they're saying some people think spanking's good, some think it's bad. The second paragraph, I said a study. So again, we have mention of a study, but it's not the main idea. It's just one of the ways that they choose to explain their main idea. The study shows effects on a very specific thing that certain people say happens to kids who are spanked. I'm not going to spell the whole thing out because that would be a lot of writing. But what I wrote is study shows specific effects later in life on sexual interactions. So they only mention one thing that they're saying could happen to kids that get spanked there. That's why it's a tiny paragraph. The next one says the argument of each side, re-emphasis on split opinions. So the third paragraph to me, I thought focused on re-emphasizing that there's very much a split between people who think it's good and bad. And then they're explaining why it's hard to study. And they're explaining the argument of each side. So they're reiterating that there's a split in opinions. They're giving you a reason why people think it's bad that think it's bad, a reason why people think it's good that think it's good. Very big paragraph, lots going on. And so it's essentially giving you the arguments of each side is what I said the big one is. That one, there's not a lot of variation in that focus. So if you didn't catch that it's giving the argument in each direction and you didn't catch that it's kind of re-emphasizing the split, you might have had a critical strategy issue there. The fourth paragraph is all about the side who thinks it's good. So it's explaining the people who think it's good, why they think it's good, and this is why I'm not writing these down because it's a lot of stuff to write. So they're explaining the side further. They explained each person's side here. They're further explaining the side of people who think spanking is a good thing here, but they're letting you know how it would need to be done. So there's a differentiation between inappropriate and appropriate spanking having to do with the parent and what they are conveying to their kid in terms of their emotion and their position when they're doing it. The last paragraph, I said more research is needed, but the safe approach is to not spank for now because we don't know if it's okay or not. Basically what the author is saying, the author is barely slightly leaning to the side of don't spank because the author's like, well, in the meantime, until we can conclusively say this does or does not happen to kids that get spanked, you should not spank because there is a possibility that it does create sexual aggression later in that kid's life. So the author is essentially saying we're doing more research, but in the meantime, it would be safest, in the author's opinion, really, to not spank just in case this thing actually turns out to be accurate. 16 asked for the best title. That is reading 1 because best title is another way of asking for the main idea. I said C, and I wrote down a couple of reasons why the others aren't true. Parents have different ideas on punishment is actually the topic. That was the topic sentence. They introduced that, but obviously our main idea needs to be more specific. Essentially, this being answered correctly comes down to you realizing that you should title something for its main idea, not title something for its topic. D was just about a specific study, and the study is not part of the main idea in this case, so we don't want that in the main idea. And then B is way too general, and it's actually, B is actually too general and too specific. It's just talking about their emotions in general as opposed to at the time of spanking a kid. But it's also from paragraph 3, specific discussion that happened in a certain paragraph. We never want to title something for its topic, and we never want to title something for what one of its paragraphs was about. 17, I said, would come from reading 1 because it's understanding how they used a certain word, and integral would mean central. Initial means first, so remember that there's a usage of the word initial that kind of means at the beginning. So they're not saying that it's, they're saying it's an important, emphasized issue as opposed to saying it's first, it's early. Both C and D actually mean the same thing, that it's unimportant, irrelevant. Obviously, those are sort of the opposite of what they're saying. They're saying it is a really important thing. So integral would mean important, emphasized, critical, necessary, which is a way that you can use central as well. Hopefully I have subliminally helped you with that particular question because I talk about central as important. I use the word initial in my curriculum to mean the first thing that you do, and I use the word central to mean the important things that you focus on. 18 is what can be inferred, which is very much reading 3. I said that A and B were both too far. I said that C was stated in paragraph 4. And I said that D was the answer. More research would be needed to prove the effects of spanking. Here's why that's accurate. If you felt like D might have been stated, you would be wrong. And it's very important on logical conclusion or inference to make sure you actually do kind of go back and check what they said. So your critical strategy helps you remember a lot, but not everything. So you want to make sure that you always go back through and look for how did they actually approach something, because you might have inferred something immediately when they said something. And so in your memory, you might think, no, they said that, they stated that, and they may not have. So your brain will naturally, and I talk about this a fair amount in reading 3, your brain will naturally fill in the blanks. Your brain naturally infers all the time. Much of our communication actually is inferred. So that's a natural thing to do. So always go back if you think, if you basically look at all your answers and you're like, they're either stated or they're too far, go back, check with the too far ones, check that it actually is too far and that they didn't actually set up a thought process. With the stated ones, make sure it's actually stated. D was not stated. What they said is that the issue remains divided. So they said the issue remains divided, and then they said research continues. That is all they said. The issue remains divided, research continues, and then they went to, in the meantime, you should probably do this, and that. They did not say more research is needed to prove the effects of spanking. You're inferring that from the fact they said it remains divided, research continues. Your brain is inferring, oh, that means to prove whether or not this effect exists, we need more research. This is something that has been spotted on the test. This is an actual passage by an actual person, so I did not alter it. I just credited it to the person who wrote it. So this is an actual potential thing you actually could see, and copyright allows it to be here. So I'm not going to, I guess I'll also mention this is not a situation where you're going to identify a main idea and focuses, because it's just one paragraph and it's a very artistically, abstractly written paragraph as well. They're essentially alluding to these different things throughout this process without actually stating a main idea, without stating specific details. So this would be, you would kind of deal with this the way you would deal with like a poem or even a memo, things that you just read through and then think about what was the purpose, what was the main idea. So you would have that thought at the end. The first question they asked you was, what is the theme? Theme is talked about in reading 1. You don't see theme questions very often, which is good because a lot of people think that they're difficult. The reason that they said theme here is there really isn't exactly a main idea in this. Everything was alluding to something as opposed to being stated and focused on. So they could have also put main idea here and you would have actually answered it the same way. But in this particular instance, theme does kind of make sense. What are they getting at this whole time? Remember that a theme is what they're getting at, what they're emphasizing without emphasizing it specifically, what they're getting at that they're not saying. If you don't remember theme, definitely go back to your reading 1 packet where it's defined. You can find a theme in a couple of different ways. This is a third way, I guess you could say, because this is what happens when they don't actually stop and make a main idea. So you kind of end up with the whole thing being somewhat of a theme. If that were the case, the theme was D. They basically were trying to get at the fact that dependence in an economic sense and in certain other senses that they barely allude to is hindering the growth of a soul. And it goes back to this repeatedly. It keeps saying, well, as long as you're depending on something, you can't fully grow. You can't fully, expand your moral ground. And it kind of keeps going back to that. This one is going to be one that the other answers being wrong is going to have a lot to do with you figuring out which one is right, which is a more common issue than I've made it seem within this particular mock. Remember, there's a lot of situations, especially I talk about it with inference and logical conclusion. What they gave you as answers will always determine what the best answer is. You could have an answer that would be right in one question and that it would be wrong in the same question later, purely because there's an answer that is better. So they definitely aren't describing a road to self-reliance. They're getting at the fact that self-reliance would be helpful to the growth of your soul, but they're not playing out a road to that whatsoever. Justice and goodness are not really talked about or mentioned. And then faith and self-sacrifice, there is no mention of faith at all. I don't remember a mention of self-sacrifice either. Even if you felt like you found one of the parts of an answer, you would not feel as strongly that it was alluded to as you would with D. 20 is also from reading 1 because it's the historical context, which involves you understanding the passage in general. The historical context is best played out with C. They are focused on restriction of women. Hopefully you noticed that and you kind of felt like, what? because this is old. This was written at a time that women were much more restricted, that they were much more dependent on men much more often. They mention men specifically as having control over women and things like that. That should have told you this is not a current article or a current situation. Interest in social life would be bad because an interest in social life is timeless. So that would not tell us, oh, this was written at a certain point because they're talking about social life. Social life could be mentioned currently, could be mentioned way back in the Dark Ages, and any time in between. So that would not give us a time frame. Speaking of the Dark Ages, they did mention the Dark Ages, but they said that that was in the past. So the way they said Dark Ages makes it obvious that the Dark Ages was previous to this. Emphasis on morality is similar to what I said about D, that it's timeless. Morality is always an issue. It was discussed heavily. Morality was discussed very heavily in the passage, but that wouldn't give you a time frame. Dark Ages would give you a time frame, except they mentioned it like it was in the past, and you can't tell if it was 1 year in the past or 15 years in the past or 200 years in the past. So that doesn't help us because it was mentioned as long ago, but not specifically when. So I would say the two that are very obviously not the answer are B and D. And then mention of the Dark Ages versus the focus on restriction of women. It would be much easier to go back in history and figure out that women were restricted at certain points in time, more so than other points in time, and how that evolved. That would be the best way for you to figure out when. Historical context is when was it written? What was going on in history at the time it was written? I'm going to go back to 19 really quick because I actually just noticed as I was underlining that they literally mention faith and self-sacrifice. So if I said they didn't mention them and you were like, what? They did mention those. Little did I know, the reason that I didn't know they mentioned them was they are not central to the point at all. It's something they mentioned right at the beginning, and they're mentioning it as something that way back when, long before this passage was written, those were important and those were the central focuses, but it's just a mention. So A on number 19 is most definitely mentioned, but it's only mentioned, and then it's mentioned in a previous context that is not timely to what is happening right now. And it's definitely not the theme because it's not the main thing that's alluded to. In this case, the theme is another way of saying the main thing they're trying to get at. So if you were confused just simply because I said that they did not mention faith or self-sacrifice, my apologies, they totally did. Doesn't change the answer. They definitely focused on dependence and what that does to moral growth more so than any other thing. The next passage, again, you just probably got a main idea. I guess what I'm saying is a main idea is that it's not structured where you identify that and then you identify how things play that out, because it's just one paragraph. It's one paragraph that says, many people think HIV and AIDS is the greatest public health threat. Little do some of those people realize malaria is a bigger threat than HIV and AIDS. They don't really talk about any other disease, which is going to be important to the way we answer questions. And then they mention that the reason maybe people don't realize the threat of malaria is that it's eradicated in the US, and we're talking about people who live here and what they think. 21, I said you would get by understanding the concepts of reading 2. It says, what's the best description of the author's purpose in the first sentence? Just in the first sentence. I fixed this and somehow it still made it to the final copy. It's just supposed to say first, not firsts. I don't know how the S got into my new copy. So just the one sentence. The one sentence is, most Americans are aware that HIV/AIDS is a huge threat to public health worldwide. Why did they use that sentence? Why did they introduce with that sentence? That was to connect to the frame of reference. If they had used that sentence and then continued on just talking about HIV and AIDS, we would have a different answer. The reason that it's the social frame of reference, the reader's frame of reference, is that HIV AIDS is not the point, and it's not the focus of the passage at all. So they mention something that isn't their main idea first. They mention something that is not their main idea because they want to relate to what you know, so that after that they can say HIV and AIDS is a big issue. You would be right to think it is a danger to public health, but malaria is quite a bit more of a danger to public health. So they're trying to get you to think of this big, bad, horrible, scary disease so that they can say, well, here's one that's quite a bit worse than the one you thought was really bad. 22 you would get from reading 3 because it's a logical conclusion. The logical conclusion that you would get is B. So with B, they said a likely reason that Americans don't realize the threat of malaria is because it's eradicated within American culture. So the point that they're making without making it, hence how it became a logical conclusion as opposed to a detail, is infection rates within a certain area will affect whether the people who live in that area understand something or not. There is no malaria in the US. There's no reason for most average US citizens, especially people not in the healthcare field, would be thinking about or aware of malaria. So they really said eradication is the reason why people don't know, and we can infer that how many people are infected with something in a community will affect that community. And that's important because you can't say worldwide understanding of malaria is affected by its infection rate in America. They're saying that Americans are not aware of it because in America, we don't have it. What I said about the other one, A is too far because they did not mention infection rates of any other disease. All they said is that those are two of the worst. We don't know how other diseases may fall within that. So they don't clearly say these are the two that are the greatest threat. They focus on those two. They compare them to each other, but they don't say whether they are number 1 and number 2 specifically. So that would be too far from what we know. C, what I said about C is it's also too far because we know that in one instance, we had a successful eradication of a certain disease. The way this is written says eradication efforts have a high rate of success. And because it doesn't specify anything, that would mean they always do. We don't know about eradication efforts and how successful they are with other diseases. We just know this one instance. So it's too far to say, oh, it's always successful to eradicate a disease. I think if it were always successful, the flu would probably be eradicated. D, I said that they did not talk about because it was not a key factor in winning the war. It may or may not have had anything to do with winning or not winning a war. They don't talk about that. You could have answered D because you could have read it too quickly and thought, oh yeah, eradicating malaria was a key factor in the war and in the safety of our troops, and that would all be true. But they are saying that the emphasis is winning the war. That is not something that they talked about. 23 is also from reading 3 because it's an inference. The thing we could infer is D. During World War II, soldiers traveled to areas that had active infection. Again, you may have inferred that already, and you may have felt like that was stated. It wasn't. What they said was scientists sought new medicines and methods to control spread amongst troops during World War II. So all they said about that was that scientists found new medicines and methods to control spread during that time. They did not say that soldiers traveled to areas that had malaria, but we can infer that they did because otherwise, why would scientists be trying to create a way to stop it from spreading amongst the troops? A, is wrong. So the way that they said A is the opposite of what they should have said. It says AIDS poses a greater threat. They said that malaria poses a greater threat than AIDS. B is too far. Malaria poses the greatest public health threat of any disease. We don't know that. And even if they did actually say that, you would have to factor in the changes of times and the fact that we may not have known about something. But they did not say that. They did not say malaria is the single most dangerous, most infective, most anything of any disease in the world. And they did not give us any info to assume that. The greatest risk requires us to know how all the greatest risks stack up against each other. C, I said, is stated. Many believe that HIV/AIDS is the most dangerous across the globe. The fact that many believe it's the most dangerous is stated. The only difference here is Americans versus not Americans. They said many Americans believe earlier in the article. This just says many believe. If many Americans believe it, then it's also stated that many believe, because that's more general. The next one is a memo. You should definitely expect to see a couple of memos in your passage. Again, you can't really do critical strategy exactly on a memo. So as a reiteration of what I want you to do in situations where there's not necessarily a critical strategy is read the whole thing. Always read everything, because they've got to and from and what it's regarding, and then they've got this thing at the end. Then before you go to look at the questions, just think, what was the main focus? What was the point the author was trying to make? What's the purpose? Who is it to? Who might it be from? And so on. 24, I said, comes from reading 1 because it's an understanding of the main idea of the memo. They actually did tell you here that it's a memo, just in case you didn't know. So that's good. That actually helps you focus your answers. The answer here should be C. 25 says which conclusion you can draw from the memo. Again, they're giving you a hint that this is a memo. A is the thing that we can draw. A winner will be selected sometime after December 5th. So sometime is general enough that we can say that without information that's specific. We get this inference because you have to submit your nominations on that day. So it's fair to assume they can't select the winner prior to that, but that sometime after they get all the submissions, then they'll make a decision. B is too far. It says there will not be very many nominations. We have no idea how many there will or won't be. We don't know the size of the audience that this is written to or anything else. I also said too far for C. In fact, I said too far for all the other answers. Employees cannot nominate themselves is not mentioned either way. So we can't infer that they can or can't, because we would need a little bit of context to assume that you can or can't do that. Each person will submit 2 to 3 nominations. We have no idea what each person will submit. If you felt like you were torn between A and C, remember that inferring C would be you inferring from your own life, your own experiences, what you believe to be something that would make sense and not make sense, rather than drawing it from the memo. So remember, you're drawing this conclusion from the memo. The author implied something that you can then turn around and get an inference or a logical conclusion from. If they don't say anything about nominating yourself or not, and they don't allude to it, we can't bring our own knowledge in. We have to be getting it from the memo. 26 is from reading 2. What's the purpose of the passage? A memo informs. I get a lot of questions from different memos that I integrate in the class material in different places. Memos inform. Memos are written by someone who is in charge of making sure that employees understand what's going on. A memo is always for information. There's a memo in one of my reading classes that a lot of people feel should be to express feelings. It's the one, I think it's in reading 3, and it's about people stealing other people's lunches. And although feelings are expressed in there, like the person who's writing it is an HR person, but they're saying that people have been upset because they don't have food when they go to grab it. that is expressing someone else's feelings as part of informing people. Same goes when they're writing a memo to tell you to that you should do a particular thing or that you should stop doing a particular thing. Sometimes memos will have consequences. If you don't stop doing this, or if you're found to be doing this, this is what's going to happen. All of those things do not affect the general purpose of a memo. They're informing you. They might be informing you about how certain people are feeling. They might be informing you about a new rule. They might be informing you about consequences for not following a certain rule. They could be informing you about any and all of those things. But they're informing you. These are the consequences. This is what we're asking you to do, or this is what we're asking you not to do. This is what's been happening and how people have been reacting. It's always informative. That will help you on the next one. Reevaluate this next one if you happen to be starting to think, wait a second, does that apply to the next one? Reevaluate this one a little bit. I did write the questions in a way that will help you understand this. So 27 came from reading 1, general understanding. What statement is accurate? So they're not asking you what they did or did not state specifically. They're not asking you to derive a detail. They're asking you what would be accurate. So if I state what they stated in A, would that be accurate based on the memo, and so on. The one that is accurate is B. A, they're not asking you to drink less water. They're asking you to drink a certain type of water versus another type. C and D are both incorrect because they've got a detail backwards. So on C, they want you to do that, not the company to do it. On D, the company will do that, not you. So they've got you and the company in the wrong place. 28 is from reading 2. What type of passage is this? This is a memo, which the full name of a memo is memorandum. This one, you notice, is referring to it as a passage because they're not trying to give you the answer to whether it's a memo or not, but it's a memo. It's a notice to employees. It's management or HR giving information to everyone who works somewhere, which is always what a memo is. A blog post does not look like this. A blog post is one person's experience or opinion or something like that. A classified ad would be an ad for something that you're selling or buying or something like that. And a biography would be a life story of someone. So those are all way off. 29, what is the main purpose of this passage, is from reading 2. So types of passages and purposes of passages are from reading 2. The main purpose of this passage is to inform. If you thought maybe it was to persuade, you wouldn't be that crazy, because this does seem like, although they are informing you of what they want you to do, they're also definitely kind of doing, in certain places, they're doing something to try to persuade you to do this, as opposed to just putting information out. Remember, it's a memo. Memos inform. So even if they want you to do something, which most memos really, if you think about it, they do want you to have a particular response, but they're giving you the information about what's changing, what they want you to do or don't want you to do. They're giving you info about the consequences. In this case, the consequence is a reward for acting in the manner that they want you to. But that doesn't make the whole memo persuasive. The memo is telling you, we want you to save energy. Here's the things we are requesting that you do. And then there does happen to be a reward for you to do it, but they mention that at the end. I helped you play this out by giving you another question immediately after that question, again from reading 2. This one wants to know the final 2 sentences. I did that to make you think, wait a second, did I answer 29 wrong? Because definitely the final 2 sentences are to persuade. Hopefully answering number 30, you thought, wait a second, if I took those final 2 sentences out, would that mean that the purpose of the rest of the memo, which would be the vast majority of the memo, was more informative? Hopefully, if you answered 29 wrong initially, hopefully 30 made you go back and answer it differently, and hopefully you changed to inform. If not, hopefully you're currently looking at these 2 things and realizing, oh yeah, They spent the majority of the time just letting you know what they want you to do and don't want you to do. And then at the end, they got persuasive by saying there will be rewards if you do the thing you want to do. So the final two sentences are definitely persuasive. The memo as a whole is a memo, which makes it informative. All of this is telling you specific things they want you to do or don't want you to do. That is informative. That is to provide you the info. This last part, or this next thing, is completely its own thing. She said that the imperative for the project was to improve productivity, test new processes, and eliminate all redundancies. Why is the italic being used? This is primarily from reading one of understanding the way that the author is putting the information together. The italics are to place emphasis. These are always tricky questions. I get a lot of questions on them. What I would say is always look at all answers and use all of the answers to understand what the best one is, because these answers depend on what your choices are. There may be a better way to explain the way they used italics here, but obviously you only have these 4 choices. It's not illustrating a Latin root. First of all, this says a phrase comes from a Latin root. That's very clearly a phrase that would come from our use of language currently. To denote that a title is being used, eliminate all redundancies is not a title. So that would also be wrong. To indicate a sarcastic use of italicized words, initially you might think maybe, but they're not being sarcastic. They're seriously saying we want to eliminate redundancy. So it's not sarcastic. So to place an emphasis on one part of the series, they mentioned 3 things they want to do. They're trying to say that the most important of the 3 is the third one that they mentioned, which is eliminating redundancy. The human brain is the next passage. What I said from the intro is that my main idea is the brain is the command center and the storage place for memory. So it's obviously going to be a general article about the brain. That's okay if that's what you said the main idea is. If you got more specific and said, oh, the brain is a command center and stores memories, that would be based on your more specific thesis statement. Remember that a thesis is the specific place where they state the main idea. Every article has one. You don't need to go out of your way to find a thesis unless they ask you for a thesis. It's normally the best process to just read the whole intro and think, what do I personally, as the reader, think I'm going to see in the next few paragraphs, and form your main idea that way. If they ask you for a thesis, it's often the very last sentence of the intro, but again, you can't count on that. So you want to pick out, where do they actually give the main idea? This is where they actually give the main idea in this case. Second paragraph was the parts. They mention a few specific divisions of the brain and what they do. So that was a pretty simple, long paragraph because they're giving a lot of info, but ultimately there's 3 major sections. Here's what they do. The last paragraph is about the fact that the brain can be damaged easily and what the effect would be, or the effects rather would be, if that were to happen. 32 comes from reading 1, your general understanding of the way the info is used. Make sure you always read all choices, always, 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 because so often in reading, our answer is dependent on our choices. That is the case here because all 3 of the answers that they gave leading up to D, which then says all of the above, were specific things that they said would happen. What is the main focus of the article? This should say that it's question 33. I don't know why it doesn't. Again, this is from 1 because it's the main focus or the main idea, and that's going to be A. It always depends on the choices because the brain being one of the most important is actually not the greatest way to explain what this article was about. This was about the brain, what it is, how it works, the parts of it, and the fact it could be easily damaged. That said, B, C, and D all mention something that is a specific part of the grand detail as opposed to being the whole entire thing. Again, I don't know why there's a numbering problem here. This should have been 34. Don't change your numbering because it'll affect the whole rest of it. But those are two questions that for some reason are not numbered. By the time you see this, I probably will have made those edits, so yours might be numbered right. What should be question 34 is, what is the meaning of the word degenerative? I again said reading 1 would be where you would get this. Worsening, deteriorating, or declining. If you had trouble with this, degenerative is a very common word used in healthcare because it describes a lot of disease types. Most of you probably are familiar with that. So that would be a word that you would want to know the meaning of. There's not many of those. I always get asked, well, what list of words could I study for the reading test for what they're going to ask me for in context? The vocab section, you actually do have a way that you can study specific words that come up on vocab. Word in context in reading could be anything. It could come from anywhere. It could be a word you're very familiar with or totally not familiar with, and there's no way to predict that. But this is one of the things you would want to know the meaning of. The next question, which might be labeled on yours by the time you see this as 35, and that would be 36. Which of the following statements is true about the author's tone? We don't talk about tone a lot, but we did talk about it in reading 1. A and B are the two that you should have been thinking were possible because they both say, oh, discussing the parts and functions of the brain. That's most definitely what the author was doing. He's not lighthearted or humorous, either one, so C would be out. He's not worried that the reader will injure their brain, and that's not a tone. That's like a verb phrase. The author is actively worried about. That's not what tone is. So C and D came out easily. The difference between A and B is only one thing. Is the tone laid back or is it serious? The tone is formal. This is a formal tone. It's written formally. It's written academically to explain academic information. So we would be better off saying it's serious, especially when it gets to the injury part. They're being very serious. They're not being laid back. And again, laid back is not really a tone. I'm not saying there couldn't be an answer where laid back was the appropriate phrase to use, but it's not a tone type. So you would only pick something like laid back if all the other answers are terrible. 36 is what this next question's number should be, comes out of reading 2. The main purpose of the article as a whole is to educate the reader about the parts of the brain and how they function. This is a purpose question that has purpose statements. It doesn't just say to inform, to explain, to persuade, and so on. You end up with an answer that has something that's not a passage type. What you'll notice is only one of the 3 answers actually had the correct word right at the beginning. That one does not properly say what the main purpose was, because the main purpose is what they truly set out to explain. That is most definitely this right here. This takes precedence over saying to inform. So it's better to say educate, even though that's not a passage type, and then say about the parts and their function, than it is to say, oh, we got inform in there and that's a good passage type, but it's not to inform you just about the fact that millions of neurons fire. That's a very big understatement of what their purpose was. 35 wants to know the purpose for the above entry, which is this little ad. That would come from reading 2 because it's purpose. Both of these questions come from 2. What is the main purpose for the above entry? This does not have information about this car. It's a picture. It's taken in nature. It's supposed to be in a really pretty spot. It says the all-new compact hybrid, nature reinvented. None of that's informative. That's not giving you facts about the car. So what is their purpose? It's to persuade. It's an ad. Generally speaking, an ad would be persuasive because you want to think about main purpose. Why did the author create it in the first place? An ad would typically be created to convince you to come look at something or to buy something. That said, if they gave a whole bunch of facts and statistics and raw information about the car, that might be different. They're not going to give you that. They're not going to give you an ad that explains the car. The reason I'm mentioning this is when I tried to go and find this to put this on here, there actually were some that I was like, well, that does more informing than it does advertising. If they give you an ad, it's persuasive. And then a persuasive ad, an ad specifically, would be found in a classified section. Some of you don't even know what a classified section is. I learned that when I used to tutor all the time because it's kind of previous old years back kind of thing. Classified is where things are purchased and sold. So you would do a classified ad if you're looking to buy or obtain a particular thing, or if you're looking to sell something. An editorial, the only reason you could have been confused here is if you did answer persuade, you might remember me saying that an editorial is a persuasive article, but it's an article. It's paragraphs written as opposed to a picture with a couple of words on it. So that's why that's not right. An editorial expresses an opinion in writing. This is not written. This is very much a picture. An encyclopedia and a blog would be way off. The last passage is this little tiny paragraph about allergen patch tests. The first question is from reading 3. We can infer that contact dermatitis is, from the way that they talk about it in the article, it's an acute condition caused by inflammation or irritation of the skin. What they basically said is they use these patch tests to expose skin on purpose, to expose skin to something that might irritate it so that they can find out what is ultimately irritating it. Chronic infection caused by autoimmune. We did not see anything about it being autoimmune. Chronic condition in which contact with the skin causes irritation. We have no reason to think it's a chronic condition. And the way that they said contact with the skin is not accurate. They're saying when certain substances contact the skin, it gets irritated. So that's not a good way of describing it in comparison to how well they describe it in A. Spread by touch, we have no idea if you could spread contact dermatitis. It kind of sounds like you can't. And the last question, these numbers will also be different. By the time you see this, that should say 37, that should say 38, that should say 39, and that would make this 40. As long as it catches my save, hopefully, since it didn't the last time. What is a logical conclusion based on the passage comes from 3. The substances used in the patches are similar to or the same as substances known to cause contact dermatitis. That is the inference you're supposed to get. They didn't say that. They said these patch tests have this, 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 and that in them. This, and that are known to cause contact dermatitis. So you're able to infer that these patches are supposed to intentionally create this reaction by mimicking what's in the substances that would naturally cause the reaction. B would be too far. We don't know if they are always effective, never effective, sometimes effective, and we have no idea if we can say that they're not always effective because they didn't say that. C is stated. It says they are administered by a doctor. And then D is way too far. We have no idea who manufactures them. Most likely more than one company manufactures them. They did not say Bayer. They did not mention Bayer somewhere in the article, so that's not a fair assumption. This mock was aimed at, obviously, practice, exposure to the test, simulation of the test, like mocks always are. But I really want you to take from this the importance of critical reading strategy. I promise you, I used to be not very good at reading tests, just like most of you and how you feel. They make the HESI and the TEAS and the CAP and the PACS and the NET and all of those really hard reading tests because a lot of people are good at reading. If you use critical strategy, it won't be difficult. It will make it like they bring the test down several levels of difficulty. That is the key. So my main point in this particular mock is to make sure you're aware of the importance of the strategy. You're getting validation for your use of the strategy. You're getting to see what my opinion is about each paragraph. Remember that it just has to be kind of the same. Everyone's going to outline differently. You're not outlining in a specific format. You're just outlining what you thought. So I do have second versions of the reading classes. If you've never taken those, those are an option. I also have a new class that is amazing for getting better at reading 1, 2, and 3, which are the ones that you need for the HESI, and combining them. How do you combine main idea, purpose, and logical conclusion to where you're thinking of them all together? There are a few places actually within the test, and for some reason I didn't note them on the board as I should have, that I thought of that class. I was like, oh yeah, if you're still struggling with this, you would want to do this. It's called Reading 1 through 3 Intense Review. It is aimed at people who are testing again or who have a gap in their study, more so than it's aimed at just a first pass through. But if you're still finding any issues with critical reading strategy, it goes back into that and the importance of that. Any issues with inferring and logical conclusions, any issue with using summaries, or any issue with purpose and passage type. That class is 2 hours and 10 minutes long, and it just brings together those first 3 classes and talks about how you can use your ability with one of those skills to boost your ability with the other skills. That could be very helpful if you are still struggling with that. So you can always request extra classes. I have tons and tons and tons more content than what I put on your initial plan. There's always specific reviews available that are short, things that zone into one skill or another skill. They're supplemental, they're super cheap and super short. There are intense review classes that are super long and really emphasize how to get excellent at something instead of good at it. There's all kinds of mocks. I have lots and lots of mocks depending on what test you're taking and how many you've seen. I may have more mock testing that you can do. And those are all things that you can request whether or not they're on your plan. So if you're having trouble with anything specific, even if it's not one of the things we just discussed, always let me know that and I can tell you what the options are. If you are still struggling with some of this, that intense review class would be wonderful. I also have focus classes that go into one or another skill that is specific to those classes. That might be a good thing. So let me know how this went, how you scored, what your number was correct out of the total 40 that are actually there. And then let me know if there's something that you want to zone further into. So that is it for this particular mock. This may be the first reading mock you're seeing because I'm probably going to move it in the plan up to the first one. So if you just took your reading classes and then you saw this mock immediately after, you do have another mock coming in your plan at the end if this is the first one you're seeing. If not, if this is at the end, there may be more mocks than what you've seen, depending on if you've seen 2 or 3 of them. So let me know what you need to dive further into, what I might be able to help with, and we can go from there. And that is it for reading mock 3. I will see you guys later.